Well, thanks so much, Denise. Wow, what an incredible honour to be here with you today in person and to chair this opening panel for the SIPL conference. You've set us up for a brilliant conference over the next couple of days, and hopefully this panel can also meet those aims of sparking some interesting conversations that we can continue over across the next couple of days. As Denise said, I'm Vicki Herrington. I work as the Director of Knowledge for the Australian Institute of Police Management, which is all the way in Sydney, but I haven't come that far. I've come all the way from down south, having been marooned as a COVID refugee some years ago, and decided I quite liked it after all. So it's a very great honour to be here, very great honour to be asked to chair this panel. I'm not going to go through reading the long, illustrious bios of our panel members. They are incredible people to have managed to make time for us to come to this panel. And I know that we will learn a little bit more about each of them as we go through the next hour or so of conversation and answering some of the questions that we've got for them. Monica, some weeks ago, went out to each of you and asked whether or not you had any particular questions you would like to pose to the panel, and thank you for the responses that we got. What we've managed to do is curate those and thematicize, is that even a word? Thematicize those so that we can have a kind of a general conversation. So my apologies up front to anyone who submitted a question that isn't asked exactly as you submitted it, but hopefully the intent of what you were trying to get at is covered. And if not, I'm sure you can always, tackle them on the way out the door. So my intent is to try and keep us to time, which I have been told is 2:50, not least of which because I have to get my way 5 floors up to the roof to run a 90-minute workshop straight afterwards, so I will try and keep us to time. And my apologies to the panellists if it feels of any way that I cut you off or wind you up, but I'm very conscious of the time that you've provided with us today, and I want to honour that appropriately. So I think that is all we need in terms of scene setting. Denise, you set out the scene for us today, the theme of the conference being contemporary policing demand, enhancing capacity, capability and resilience. And I've asked each panel member to maybe spend a couple of minutes each just exploring what that means for them. Maybe if you can give us a sense of what are the conversations that you think we should be having over the next day and a half. Martin, perhaps we'll start at the far end of the panel with yourself and then work along.
Well, that's a pretty big ask. I'll do my very best. For me, it's trying to understand and disentangle the demand issue. I'm going to give you a little bit of what I was talking in Parliament this week about that. I think the second one is about innovation and about what we mean by that and risk. And probably the third one is really about the place of policing in a modern society and the crimes as they move, as Iain says, online being the new front line, which is a nice phrase to talk about. So I just take the first one, which is demand. I sincerely believe that the right to call the state through the police is a hard-won right. And it shouldn't be taken for granted, and it isn't available to a huge number of societies. That the demand is so high is a proxy for trust in police. 87% of people trust police, but they show it by calling the police every 9 seconds, 24/7, 360 days. That is a critical area of the demand, and I think we should welcome it because it shows you the role that police can play in a society. What the issue is when a police officer is dispatched, and we should at some stage, we'll talk about the CALM, the biggest change, C-A-M, the biggest change in policing in my time on the police authority, the dispatch is the largest change. What happens is when they get there. And so you have the authority of a warranted officer, often it's necessary, to direct a response, but frequently they can't, there's nothing they can direct to. So here is where the conversation lies, because by default, the police are then with that person, not able to let them go, often very vulnerable and in distress. And therein lies the key issue for policing demand, the lack of alternative services for people who are distressed. And I would just leave you with this one, is that when when 101s were separated from 999s, very recently, in Hazel Blair, I think, started it, it was actually a joint service with local government. And I sincerely believe that by becoming a police service, it's then pushed onto policing the responsibility the responsibility for dealing with distress and vulnerability. And as Ian and all his staff will tell me, 80% of calls for service they get in are not related to crime, they're related to distress and vulnerability. So I say you start at the front end, you have a distribution service, 101, which has more than police in it, and then you have a delivery service for people. And I'll make this final point. Quite often people talk about the Christie Commission in Scotland, and they talk about prevention. That wasn't the first bullet point that Christie made. The first bullet point he made was person-centred services, and we do not have mental health or vulnerable services which are person-centred. They are distributed amongst various services, and that is incoherent. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Ian, please.
Okay, thank you. Maybe just a couple of words of introduction in terms of the role of SIPR, if I may, and I really suppose just to congratulate SIPR on, this is the 10th annual conference, I understand, but 15 years since it was established, and I have been, at a personal level, an enormous supporter of SIPR since its inception. I don't know if Nick Fife is here, but I remember some early conversations, the development of it, the concept of bringing together all the academic community, recognising the independence of academia, and also recognising the operational independence of policing. But the foresight to build that model where all academic institutions would work on a collaborative basis, would look to work closely with policing, to challenge us to develop best practice, to make sure that people were outward looking. Again, candidly, I've been a strong supporter from my days as the head of CID in Edinburgh, through as an ACC, and again, to see the strength of SIPR as it is now, again, I really commend that work, and certainly as long as I'm Chief Constable, I will always be a very, very strong supporter of the work that SIPR does, currently under Liz, but I think it's something that all of us own and all of us have to commit to. So thank you for the invitation today. Mondays are a horrendous day to have a conference or an event, I say I am here because I think it is so important, and again, fantastic to see everybody physically together, stimulating ideas, developing ideas, challenging each other. I suppose maybe just my first observation in terms of demand, and again, colleagues like Tom McMahon and others who in Police Scotland have heard me say this, I actually prefer need. We talk about being citizen-focused. Demand is actually quite introspective. That's demand on us. Well, actually, the reason people are calling us every 9 seconds is because they have needs. Now, some of them might be low level, some of them might not actually be policing needs, but there is a need that is not necessarily being met from the current way that either their personal lives have been led or the support that they're getting from the state, from the infrastructure, from their community. So those needs that are often come into policing, one of the big questions for us, and we constantly talk about it, and we will use demand, but I'm just making a challenge to ourselves about not being introspective, about let's remember that actually these are members of the public, families in need, vulnerable people in need who are seeking the assistance from the police. When those contacts are made, should we be narrowing it into a crime role? We've always traditionally been measured on that. What's the robbery detection rate? What's your stop and search figures? What value is it in terms of our approach to knife crime? Where are we with domestic house break-ins in the city of Edinburgh? All of these are really, really important measures and really, really important factors. But I think we should proudly assert what policing is, what the Police Service of Scotland does, but what policing as a mission does. You may or may not have heard me say it through the pandemic, but the pandemic was a good example of that, when there was a public health imperative for the country and policing had a core role to play in that. But crucially, through the pandemic, just as in every day, that role was not simply one of enforcement. Again, it's another bugbear of mine, increasing Americanisation, law enforcement. I'm not the Chief Constable of the Law Enforcement Service of Scotland. I'm the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Scotland. And policing is about protection, prevention, social cohesion. Yes, we enforce the law when the law is broken and it's clear that criminal justice sanctions are required to bring justice to communities. But that enforcement element, as we saw through COVID, was at the far end of that continuum. The police role historically is around the need for that preventative capacity, that need to bring social cohesion, to protect people who are at risk. So therefore, we should talk about policing and we should talk about meeting citizens' needs. The other point I think I would wish to make and reflect upon, and this is one genuinely for society, led by academic community, certainly led by those of us involved in policing, but it's one for society to determine, is what is the full role, remit, authority, legitimacy of policing? An example I would give in that regard is how we are now charged as a service to be where people live their lives. So when I started in the police service 30 years ago, quite literally, it was the public space that we policed. I worked in the city centre in Edinburgh, so I would work Charlotte Square on a night shift, and we would check the back door of the offices to make sure nobody was breaking in and stealing the petty cash. Those institutions still require to have that physical protection. They're more concerned now about a denial of service attack that's coming into them potentially from another jurisdiction. And again, back in those days, it was very much the public space. So you would attend an incident of domestic violence, a domestic dispute. And actually, unless there was real clear signs of physical violence, the policing role, therefore the state role, would actually stop at that front door. And the reason for that is that because at that time, the sanctity of the family was seen as taking precedence over the considerable amount of harm, violence, distress that now seems axiomatic to state was clearly going on within that family environment. So thus began the doctrine and the language of public protection, domestic abuse teams, public protection, management sex offenders, MAPA, domestic abuse disclosure schemes. None of that language existed. None of those entities existed when I started in the police. And again, bluntly, that was only 30 years ago. A massive expectation from society to meet the needs of the harms and threats within the private space. And of course, where are we now? We're now in the realms of the virtual space. And a question for me, a question for us, is what's the legitimacy of policing to be there? You hear the language of snoopers' charters, you hear the language of individual privacy rights, but actually, we all know that people are being exploited, people are being radicalised. Young children are being sexually, physically abused through the mechanism and the means of the internet. Now, defining the role for the police service, defining the role for the state in that is a broader question, just as it was in 20 years ago when we started to debate the role and remit of the state and the role and remit of policing within the private space. So when we're meeting the needs, the expectation on policing certainly is a broad one. I would say rightly so. Let's not focus on a narrow mechanism of law enforcement. Remember our principles of prevention, protection. Not because that's the soft side. Actually, if you do that right and you build legitimacy, you build trust, you prevent, you support, you enable social cohesion, it actually makes your response to homicide and counter-terror and organised crime a lot easier because you've got that community support. You need to get that holistic entity, that holistic model, to allow us then to go and police the public space, to police the private space, and increasingly, as Martin said, to police the online space. And they're not separate circles. They often align across each other, again, as we know. That's enormously challenging. And in my final 2 points, because I can sense the the moderator leaning on me from a side. I've now got a new language as well. We will curate question, and I would have vetted them, but curating them sounds easier. Because I know knowing this audience is quite a difficult audience. I know a few faces round about them, so thank you for that curation. My final 2 points, if I may, are capability. The political discourse in Scotland has all been about capacity, officer numbers. What's the strength? How many cops are on duty in Hoyok? And now, as we're on duty when Lothian Borders existed, how many cops in St Andrews now, as opposed to how we're on duty when Fife Constabulary existed? Well, my first point on that is, as I've said earlier, you don't protect the people of St Andrews simply by policing St Andrews, because the threats are coming from other spaces. We need to make sure that we are where the threats and vulnerabilities are coming from, so we can address those harms and mitigate those risks. And the second one is, we do need to build capability. Cyber capability, based on the rule of law, based on human rights, with due protections, checks, balances, measures. Increasingly for policing, it's capability we need to focus on, as well as capacity. And then my final point, again, just taking the theme, is round about resilience. You know, this audience will know better than I, as well as I, everybody in this room knows, incredibly demanding working in the police service. Whatever your role is, police officer, police staff, somebody who studies policing, somebody who's involved in it, it's relentless. The expectations are extremely high. The level of misinformation, the level of misinformed opinion, probably extremely high. I can't think of any other topic that generates it. Perhaps football. I don't know. Everybody's an expert. I don't know much about that. But it is really extremely demanding, and officers and staff now are actually under more demand and pressure than ever we were. Everything is recorded on social media. Everything is then immediately speculated about. And therefore, the responsibility of all of us to be kind to each other, to be fair to each other, to look after each other, and I'm talking about the extended police family as I defined it earlier, is more critical than ever. We as a service, all of us in this room and beyond who are involved in policing, can't protect our fellow citizens, can't meet the needs of our fellow citizens unless we are looking after ourselves and we're looking after each other. It's absolutely crucial, it's absolutely vital, and we'll maybe discuss that further later in the day. But thank you so much for the invitation today. It's lovely to see so many people here, and look forward to catching up in the rest of the day as long as I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. There's two lots of fascinating insights so far. We've talked about online as the new frontline, which I just love as a phrase, demand as a proxy for legitimacy, which I think is a really interesting way of thinking about it, and not something I think other jurisdictions are really turning the issue on its head. That's been fascinating. HMICS must be quite interested in legitimacy too, I should imagine. And so I'm curious, Craig, what do you think the conversations are that we should be having over the next couple of days?
Thank you, and thanks for the invite to come and speak. Yeah, new boy on the block, but I do have a bit of a history in Scotland, so it's great to be back. I get a bit more time to think about things in my current role than I have in roles recently, and a couple of quotes came to mind when I was preparing for today. One is, alienation is the precise and correctly applied word for describing the major social problems in Britain today. People feel alienated by society. In some intellectual circles, it is treated almost as a new phenomenon. It has, however, been with us for years. That was Jimmy Reid in 1972 when he took on the Chancellorship of Glasgow University. And I think it's absolutely appropriate to where we currently find ourselves. I'll then turn to another trade unionist. It might suggest I've got Labour leanings. I don't, but it's quite interesting where the thinking comes from. Reforms must aim to empower individuals and communities, receiving public services by involving them in the design and delivery of the services they use, both issues that Martin and Iain have touched on. And that fits in very neatly to where the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act designed and defined what Police Scotland is. That the main purpose of policing is to improve the safety and well-being of persons, localities and communities in Scotland. So it's not law enforcement. It's not about solving crime. It's about that wider societal push and need that needs to be met. So what does policing need to be able to do to meet that demand? Well, first of all, it has to have confidence, trust and legitimacy. People need to believe that the values of the organisation are ones that they can stand behind. It needs to better understand demand or need, whichever way you want to describe it, and then better understand the required capacity and capability to address the vulnerability, to investigate crime, because that's still important, and to improve the well-being of both the communities and the people within the service that are delivering that service. You can't fix society if you're not right yourself. We need to keep a close eye on that. There needs to be something around leadership. It's got to be enhanced, and not just at the most senior ranks. Training for most senior ranks is pretty good. I've certainly enjoyed it. And you get to that point that you realise that every person within your organisation is a leader, whether that's in a critical incident or in a situation that they're dealing with. And we've got to give them skills, capabilities and understanding of how to lead across sectors, across boundaries, and into a different way of thinking than that traditional command and control that policing was recognised to have. Policing's got to keep pace with technology. Things change every 6 weeks. I understand next year it'll be changing every 4 weeks. And the year after that, every 3 weeks. It gets quicker and quicker and quicker. So by the time you put an iPad on your desk, the next one's out. Can policing afford to keep up with it? Or, probably more importantly, can it afford not to keep up with it? And policing's got to ensure that other agencies and other bodies deliver on the services that they're supposed to deliver on. And that's been acutely felt across the pandemic, that some services have retreated from their roles, that they've retreated from working out with the 8 till 4 or 9 till 5. And that demand has fallen, almost by default, onto policing. But that doesn't mean that I don't think policing should be attending critical incidents like mental health crises. They should be attending, but there should be a really simple, effective way of handing that demand for a health service into a health service, and not having a police officer sitting for many hours looking after, supporting, protecting an individual. So what do I think a police officer needs to be in terms of capability? And I do like that online is the new frontline phrase. But I still think there's a need for someone who is a really great problem solver, with fantastic investigative skills, with tenacity, with a real dedication to that professional curiosity to find out what's going on and what the best outcome is that can be delivered. There's a cost of all this, though. The cost of it is not getting it right and people having a failed service. But it's expensive to have staff salaries, it's expensive to train, it's expensive for equipment, for technology. The opportunity cost, though, of not having that expense done is a failing service. And I'm not saying that's what Police Scotland is. I think it's a very effective service. But our police officers need to have effective data and be able to manipulate it. Need to have effective management of incoming demand and be allocated to go and address that where needed. Where the demand is not appropriate for a police service, it needs to be able to be rerouted to where it's appropriate to go. But that might need, as Martin said, a warranted power initially before it's then moved on. So I think there's a lot of conversation around this. We need problem-solving investigators, digitally competent, able to put a yellow jacket on the front line as well as on the online, and do it in a way that society values. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Craig. Fascinating insights. This notion of a broader remit for policing is one I think a lot of jurisdictions around the world are struggling with, and the tension between having kind of a police force which is being called on to do such an incredible breadth of work, but resisting the urge to make them policing problems, the policification of social problems. So there's a really interesting tension and balance, I think, that will be a really fruitful discussion over the next couple of days here. Denise, yourself, obviously you have a very unique perspective on the sorts of conversations we'll be having, not least by pulling the conference together along with the rest of the team. But is there anything particularly that you think you would like people to walk away having challenged us on?
Yes, although I don't like going last because everyone else says all the stuff that you're thinking about soon. But I think what I would kind of like to see is, I think it's really critical actually what the Chief Constable said about needs, and actually the police as meeting citizens' needs. But for me, and a key aspect of the conference really, and I suppose a key aspect of my own research, is about the organisation and changing the organisation. And I think actually, as well as looking outward to address, you know, the needs of communities, needs of individuals, the needs of citizens, we also have to address the needs of the people within the organisation. And I think for me that's a critical part of some of the themes that emerged for the conference. So you mentioned kind of leadership, Craig. I think obviously leadership and strong leadership is really an essential element of an effective organisation. Actually understanding what the needs are and what demand is, and actually using, you know, data and systems effectively to actually map out what our demand is, where that demand is, and then how do we address that demand. So I think, you know, again, another kind of key theme I think we have within the kind of conference. I think you talked about alienation, and I really think that's quite an important term, because one of the key things that police services, not just in Scotland, but I think across the board in democratic areas, have still struggled with is issues around diversity and inclusion in culture. You know, it's a key part of many reports that comes across. So again, how do we think about that as an organisation, ensure that while we're meeting people's needs, that we're addressing, you know, not just the public's needs, but publics. There's a broad range of different publics, and they will have different needs. So how are we thinking about that? The other thing that Craig mentioned there, and I think again, I think a couple of people did, was about capability. So capacity, increasing the number of police officers isn't the only thing that we need to do. What we also need to do is ensure that staff within the organisation, and when I refer to staff here, I don't just mean police officers, I mean police staff, that they have the skills, the knowledge, the ability to do the job that they are tasked with doing, in whatever area that is, whether it's frontline policing, it's specialist operational, it's an analyst, that they, you know, we actually equip them. And again, it's something we'll cover kind of throughout the conference. So for me, it is really about the kind of organisation. And again, I think, you know, the Chief Constable mentioned it, well-being, because ultimately we also need to protect and look after our staff to enable them to do the job to meet the community's needs. So for me, the whole thing is really about how we look inwards, because I think often we do look outwards. And if we really want to build resilience, we also need to build the organisation effectively.
Denise, thanks so much. That's so insightful. And maybe we'll pick up on that issue of resilience and well-being in particular. Chief Constable, you know, I'm wondering if you're able to give us a few insights on the challenges that you're facing in terms of workforce well-being in this era of unprecedented demand, etc.
No, thank you. And as I said, I think in my introductory remarks, that's an absolutely critical part of running a police service that is properly focused on serving its fellow citizens, discharging its ethical and sort of moral imperative that lies behind policing, the authority that it gets from the consent of its fellow citizens, and then the duty that it then holds to protect them and to serve them. I think Martin made a point in his introductory remarks. It's a I don't mean this critically, Chair, it's an obvious point, but an important point, in as much that the legislation that created the Police Service of Scotland requires us to focus on the well-being of communities, places and individuals. I mean, in some ways it's quite a remarkable remit to be given, but that is the statutory purpose and function of policing as laid out in the 2012 Act. Therefore, again, developing Denise's point, you know, if we're asked to do that for our fellow citizens, how are we judged about we as a service, and how are our officers and staff, how do they feel protected, how are they able to go and discharge their duties? Again, a couple of observations from me, and hoping that being able to speak as openly and candidly as one would wish. There's no doubt about it, in the early years of policing in Scotland, you know, we did not spend anything like enough attention on looking after the well-being of our officers and staff. Nor in fact did we spend enough attention looking after some of the key external relationships that we had. Now, I was part of that. I've been a Deputy Chief Constable in Police Service of Scotland since 2012. interim chief since 17, chief since 18. So when I'm talking about the journey, the changes, the experience of police service in Scotland, I'm not pointing the finger at anyone. I'm pointing the finger at myself and all of us, again, who've been involved in the police service, need to recognise that. Now, there's mitigations around that. We were going through an enormous period of public sector reform, unprecedented. That's why other places, other sectors don't want to do it, because they know it's hard. Doing the right thing often is hard. And actually, a lack of investment in people, a greater focus on capacity over capability. Where was the leadership training? Where was the tools, equipment, the enabling? What was the culture like? Real focus on operational service delivery and performance. But actually, we were bringing together a massive exercise in change to create the single police service. Now, I know, and since I've become chief, I've been reflecting and stressing this. We need to absolutely spend far more of a focus on people, the people inside the organisation, and the people that we're here to serve. So to create that culture, there's a whole series of elements around it. We talked about here, are they properly remunerated? I'd see David from the Scottish Police Federation. We're going through a massive increase in cost of living. We've seen the public recognition given to health workers. We've seen some of the precedents given to other sectors. Do police officers and police staff feel properly valued by their government, by their fellow citizens? These are real questions. These are legitimate questions to debate and discuss. So the operating environment for our officers and staff is crucial. The culture, I think, is absolutely vital. Denise's point as well. Can you properly feel yourself, be yourself, whatever your own personal characteristics and history is? Does the police service welcome you? Does it nurture you? Not put up with you or tolerate you or allow you to be nothing. It allow you to actually flourish and truly be yourself, because if it does, that will make policing far stronger. It will make policing far more effective. It's a moral thing to do to drive equality, diversity and inclusion. It's actually really, really good, sensible policing to make the service as effective as it can be. So we need to create a culture of care, be kind to each other, and again, as I said at the outset. Yes, we need mechanisms. We've invested in our wellbeing capability, we've recruited individuals, we've got employee assistance programmes. We're far better about discussing things. All of us involved in policing know that. Far more still to go. Put your hand up. It's okay to say I'm not okay. So the culture is important. The mechanisms are important, but also practical things. The rollout of mobile devices that we gave to all our officers and staff. Decent equipment, decent vehicles, good canteens that when you do get an opportunity for a cup of tea, they're clean, they're fresh. We're looking after our officers and staff. So there's cultural issues, there's practical issues, there's an ethos, and there has to be a sense of everybody committed, of feeling cared. I don't think officers and staff expect things to be perfect. Policing's a hard job, really hard job. But as long as there's a sense that people are caring, people are trying their best, that's what I expect everybody to do. Don't expect everybody to get everything right all the time, but everybody trying their absolute hardest and acting with integrity, and equipping and enabling officers and staff. The frustrations of a lack of investment in our ICT framework. Not Police Scotland, this is what we inherited. 64 unoccupied buildings, a mishmash of inconsistent and at times deliberately incoherent ICT. All of these issues, the single service is charged, it's our duty now to address, so we can create far better working environment for officers and staff where people can truly be themselves. And if they can truly be themselves, they can then give the best of themselves to their fellow citizens.
Thanks so much for those really important insights. And it's interesting in a world where we're on the one hand asking police officers to do even more, an incredible amount of stuff. On the other hand, we're hoping that we can focus on their well-being as well. So there'll be some interesting conversations across the next couple of days about how leadership or systems and structures can genuinely value well-being in our organisations, as we're on the one hand asking to do more, and on the other hand saying, but we want you to stay well as well. I'll be fascinated to hear the outcomes of those conversations. Martyn, in your opening remarks, you mentioned one of my favourite words, innovation. So I wondered if we might just return to that point briefly. So increasingly, we know that innovation is incredibly important for us across the whole public sector, across organisations, full stop, I should say. Communities are changing, our demands on us are changing, and all the rest of us, and we need to at least keep up and hopefully get ahead of the curve. Police Scotland's got a really important role, of course, in the Global Police Innovation Exchange, which is the kind of global coalition of 12 nations, 14 agencies, looking at what's next in policing in terms of innovation. And of course we've got Superintendent Nicola Russell. She's currently on secondment with us at the Australian Federal Police, and we're very pleased to have her with us, looking amongst other things at what leadership in innovation is all about.
I just hope she comes back, Vicky.
Well, I don't know, we might keep her.
It's the difficulty of seconding somebody to Australia.
We quite like her. Martin, what role do the SPA see innovation playing in preparing the police organisation for the future? Both in terms of, I guess, sort of incremental improvements, but also in those big step changes that seem to be being telegraphed across the conversations we've had.
Okay, let me start with the particular. Within, I think, 5 months of my being appointed, Iain and I signed a memorandum of understanding, which is about capturing the conditions by which we would discuss novel technologies and the introduction of novel deployments. And that was very important because the starting point was to define the well-being objective or whatever it was, because in the past we'd had process issues that we hadn't undertaken review of novel issues well. So that was very important for Iain and I to decide that. The second point is, I would say, this is a more general point, is that there's a misconception that innovation is always about novelty. It isn't about that. It's as though it's a supplement to our day-to-day practices. Everything we do was at one point an innovation. So in 1935, there was a terrible fire in Wimpole Street. 5 women died, and the neighbours couldn't get hold of the fire brigade, and they were outraged and wrote to the Times. And within 2 years, the first 999 service appeared. And that leads me to the point that innovation is often as a result of user experience, professional provider experience, lay experience. It rarely comes from a process of understanding, research, innovation and application. So it's very important that the professional experience of police officers, the experience of individuals is a critical driver, constant. And he's probably not very well liked by this audience, I don't know, but Jeff Bezos, the richest person in the world, says always, if you are focused on process and not outcome, you will mislead your organisation and you'll drive it into a very poor place. What I like about innovation in policing, we have 5 strategic outcomes. Again, we thrashed them out together, and our staff did. Tom's here to do that. He remembers the time. And those outcomes are measures towards, we measure those measures towards progress, and always looking for change. Just because there's a process doesn't mean to say you have to follow it. In fact, there's no excuse if it leads to a poor outcome. Think of the outcome, and the process is supposed to help you with that. And the final thing I'd say about collaboration. All my life, working for change, I have sought unusual friends. And policing and the academic community must also reach out far further and find unusual friends in order to talk about the alternative perspectives that can be applied, the curiosity that they can give to those who are driving the service, Iain and his colleagues, or looking on the research side on academics. So I look for unusual friends. And if there's a consistent criticism in the, and I used to be, forgive me, for visiting professor and doing these terrible ref things which you hate, I hated them. The consistent message is a lack of engagement outside your field. When it's a consistent message that SIPR has to act more, and I repeat in admiration for SIPR, to do that, and to be more out of our comfort zone about who we let in for conversations, because I primarily think that those that receive a service have the greatest insight into its failings. And if I would say something for myself, or my responsibilities are not, my first line of assurance is the quality of our police officers, and we have extraordinarily high quality police officers in Scotland, and really, they're the best public servants I have worked with in 50 years. I genuinely say that. So all those are places we have to go to. the final thing, I just want to make this point, because it's made in my conversations, which I have, at the invitation often of Police Scotland with my colleagues in America, and I worked for 10 years with American colleagues on this, and their conversation is moving police officers from being warriors to guardians, and that's a long, clear, current conversation at the moment. We're very fortunate to have our police officers absolutely rock solid in the guardian place. The issue for us is making the move from guardian to carer. And this is what we should be really wary of. The caring responsibilities of a police officer are about individual kindness that they show. I'm glad Iain mentioned that word. The procedural justice aspect of treating people well. Those are important, but they're not carers in our society. We have a other range of people. They are the process by which they attend distress and vulnerability. They apply their authority, and they're one of the few agents to have authority on the street, and then they try to find solutions, increasingly difficult. And in terms of well-being, I was very lucky to spend 10 years with leading a very large philanthropy organisation for the first time having money, never having to ask for £5,000. Okay, go. I loved that. But my task I set myself was move the conversation from having GDP as a measure of social progress to having well-being. I didn't want to drop GDP. It served us very well over the whole of the 20th century. You could measure social progress. Everyone in this room benefited from having GDP. Myself, first to go to university, indoor toilets, second in a generation, all those things. In the 21st century, it was unevenly distributed, and one of the major challenges of policing was the inequality that then has resulted. We must talk about that. And the well-being dashboard assessment of social progress in the social domains, the economic domains, and the political domains is critical. And policing adds something really, really important to that. And the statutory duty towards well-being is there, but it's within a context of a national performance framework, and it's in context of a national police 5-year strategy which has outcomes which are measurable well-being outcomes. So it's very important not to lose sight of it as an adjunct to the real issues, which people want to do economic. The real issues about how people live, how they will live well individually, and how they live well together. And so living well individually is individual well-being, and living well together is social well-being. And I'm delighted that police have this onerous task to improve and support our well-being. Absolutely delighted. And they embrace it. All the ones I know embrace it really strongly. They're frustrated sometimes by it, but I think it's a welcome modern phenomenon. And if there's some research out there which tells me, are there any other police services that have that as a statutory duty, I'd like to add it to my speeches, but I haven't been able to do that myself. And if there are, I'd like to know where they are. And if I could, I'd like to visit them to share all the challenges that they have, which we have too with our colleagues in Police Scotland.
It's so interesting, and I think probably from my own experience looking at organisations around the world, in many ways you were seeing a retraction of the mandate rather than an expansion of the mandate. So I think Scotland's in a really interesting position, and there's a lot to show the world about what does that expansive mandate look like in practice for policing. I really liked your comment from Jeff Bezos, who I don't hate, incidentally, but I challenge it back with Reid Hoffman's quote, who of course set up LinkedIn. And he said, if you're not embarrassed by what you first launched, then you've waited too long to launch it. So I'm really curious about, in policing, maybe this is a great conversation for us over the next couple of days, where do we find the space for mad ideas? Where do we find the space to give something a go and potentially for it to blow up in our faces? And it's a really interesting tension in an organisation which has so much legitimacy and is required to be so perfect. How do we actually find space for the inevitable failures that are associated with any form of innovation? But maybe our next question will get us there. So capability, we've mentioned it a few times, and it's a really important part of the conference theme. And, HMICS has got a really important role in shaping the future of policing. So I'm curious from your perspective, Craig, what are you seeing as the key skills we should be investing in our police organisations? I might extend that even further. I mean, are there skills we should be investing in our communities outside of police, which may also be part of this constellation of activity that's going to help us improve the well-being of the whole of the population of Scotland?
I think there's an awful lot in there. You know, you talk about capability, and people often talk about the skill set that a police officer needs to have. And I mentioned earlier on in my comments that there are certain things about policing the digital space that we need to be better at. But I think the capability of the people is very much under pressure here. Someone once said to me, with every pair of hands you get a free brain. And certainly in the first years of my policing career, an awful lot of these brains were switched off and were very much, as Iain talked about, shaking hands with padlocks at the back of Charlotte Square. We've moved a long way since then, and I think the capability that we need as police officers and police staff and volunteers, so everyone within the organisation has got to do a number of things. One of them is innovate, whether that's a local innovation and change things, as Martin talked about. But bringing that understanding of how to do the job better and continuously improve to the party is key and critical. We also need to challenge. We need our people to be able to walk into a room and challenge effectively, politely, but dynamically, so that we can do that change thing, that we can bring a different approach to things, that we don't do what we did in the past, which was pilot something new, and even when everyone knew that it was going wrong, keep going with the pilot, because it was a pilot and that's how we did things. I'd much rather see something fail early and fail often to get the better outcome. So there's got to be, for me, thinking about it differently, understanding what the front line's showing us, challenge, fail early, and improve. And if we can do that, if we can encourage that mindset that is about challenge, is about improvement, is about everyone's responsibility to get it better for the people we provide the service to, then I think we'll build that capability. Whether that's a hard skill set of how to investigate an online attack or how to support a victim of a serious sexual crime, it will improve everyone's capability when we do that.
That's really interesting, Craig. And I'm minded, I went to a speech that was done by a principal of a grammar school in Sydney once, very sort of expensive grammar school. And he talked about how they prepared their students for courteous insubordination, which really struck me as a great way of kind of trying to kind of grip together what it is you're trying to do. It's okay to challenge the leadership. It's okay to come up with different ideas to say, boss, I think you've got this wrong. But actually the way we do that in our hierarchy, I think it's a role for us to learn all about our leadership at every level of the organisation and how we want to step into that. So obviously, picking up on leadership, my particular favourite topic, and it's obviously a really central theme to the conversations we've had across this panel, but also hopefully we'll have across the next couple of days. And it strikes me that our attitudes and beliefs have really shifted, certainly in the last 10 years or so, about what we mean by leadership. And we think about it much more in terms of coalition building now. We think about it in terms of influence, creating the conditions across the organisation to be able to deal with and manage the complexity around us. Denise, you spend a really healthy or unhealthy amount of time, I'm not quite sure, thinking about police leadership. So I'm curious from you, what are you noticing, either as growth edges for the organisations, for the individuals, and what do you think we need to be talking about and investing in the near term and in the long term?
Okay, thank you very much, Vicky. It probably is an unhealthy amount of time I spent talking about this issue. I think what I've seen shift, and I think actually the Chief Constable referred to the HMICS report that was published a couple of years ago about some of the gaps in leadership. I think that has started to change, certainly from my conversations with colleagues in Police Scotland and some work that we've been doing through SIPC. I've seen a new approach to kind of leadership in Police Scotland, and I'm going to give a wee bit of a plug to colleagues that I've been working with actually in the Effective Leadership Workshop. And it relates to some of the other issues I think that kind of Martin raised about that reaching beyond ourselves and actually thinking and working with other people. And certainly one of the key areas that I've been working on with colleagues from Police Scotland is around collaborative leadership models and styles, and how actually we need to think about connecting to other organisations, because I think as we've all mentioned today, you know, policing as an organisation don't work on their own. You know, we have to work collectively to actually understand the needs of our communities and individuals, and we also have to work collectively to address those. So I think in terms of leadership, and what really we have to do, both in the short term and the longer term, is change our thinking around leadership. I think for too long, and I think it still does happen in places, and from my experience and my research, is that, you know, police for a long time were welded to a very sort of command and control style. I'm not saying that that is a wrong style, because I think there are certain times and certain operational circumstances where that style of leadership probably works very effectively, and I've heard that kind of throughout my research. There's evidence to support that. So, you know, I don't think it's about one style over the other. So we talk about transactional leadership, which is that very kind of hierarchical control, or to move to transformational kind of leadership. Actually, you might need a different style of leadership depending on what you're dealing with on that specific day. So, you know, complex circumstances demand different styles and forms of leadership practice. And I think it's about understanding what practice is required in any given circumstance and context is what we really need to move towards. We're going to hear about leadership quite a lot. One of our keynotes is going to talk about leadership, and it's that practice that's really important. And I think that shared practice, understanding not just leadership in our own organisation, but actually how we can collectively work together to lead. And I also think leadership's not something that's just at the top of the organisation. And I think, again, Craig mentioned this, it's about actually bottom up. And, you know, I think leaders are leaders as soon as they kind of come in the door when they're a recruit. So it's actually about thinking about people who enter the organisation as leaders from day one and the potential for them to be leaders, because there might be a situation where they have to lead, whether it's in an individual incident, they have to have that capability and skill. So I think it sort of goes throughout the organisation. And I do think Police Scotland have put a lot of work into moving leadership in the right direction. And I know there's a lot of investment going into developing staff and specifically looking around kind of shared leadership. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I hope it continues in the long term. Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Denise. I was wrapping my head around, you know, you can kind of, someone who's interested in leadership theories and all the rest of it, I find myself sometimes going down these rabbit holes. And my boss at the AIPM sort of, you know, metaphorically slapped me on the back one day and said, leadership, the future of leadership is easy. It's about human beings. And I think that was, for me, it was a really interesting reflection on, you know, when you're thinking about being able to be command and control on the one hand and, you know, empowering on the other hand and sharing leadership and everything, you've also got to think about creating the context in which it's okay to sort of be one thing one moment and then another thing another moment. So being able to connect as human beings and create, I guess, that climate where you can, I guess, flip and flop between. That strikes me as one of the growth edges across policing, we're neither one nor the other. Please, Chief Constable, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, please. Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Denise. Just a couple of observations, just again, quite literally building on Denise's and your own comments there. The issue of leadership and this issue on command and control, I bluntly sometimes think can misrepresent how policing actually operates. You know, the Office of Constable, which is the sort of fundamental establishment of policing in Scotland, that's my first and primary rank, regardless of Chief Constable, Superintendent, whatever vests with that. That Office of Constable is the basis from your own legitimacy and your own authority. And the exercise of discretion that vests in that Office of Constable is one that is clear. When officers deploy, there's a considerable amount of discretion that they hold to exercise. Now, our responsibility, because of the risks that we manage, because of the expectations, the level of accountability is such that we need to create parameters, we need to assist people to exercise that discretion. But we saw that definitely, again, coming back to the pandemic and to COVID. You know, we did not, as a service, I as Chief Constable did not look to be overly prescriptive on what was asked of our constables, regardless of what rank they had. I totally agree with Denise's point about the need to flex absolutely at times for a clear direction. You know, people say it's not a matter of life and death. Well, actually, a lot of times for policing, it is a matter of life and death. And if there wasn't somebody who had command, who had a structure, had a discipline mechanism, well, actually, people might die. So that was right and proper. You know, I think, as you said, Denise, that capability to exercise in that, and for all of us to accede to that, again, is crucial to the culture as well. The challenge is it's not the default leadership behaviour at all times for an increasingly complex organisation. But equally, to empower somebody that you have not enabled, to empower somebody that you have not given the skills, to delegate decision-making to somebody that you have not trained, that's an abdication of leadership. So the language round about leadership is absolutely, again, I agree entirely with Denise's comments and observations. Every single individual police officer, police staff within Police Service of Scotland has a leadership role, but it's multifaceted, and all those behaviours and all those capabilities are required. And then the final point, again, and this is about giving confidence to people, I speak to newly promoted officers at all different ranks, and I know there's an enormous expectation. I've become an inspector. I'm now a superintendent. Enormous expectation. And there's a sense that actually they now must have all the answers, and therefore because they have got this responsibility. And I say to them, I don't expect you to have all the answers. I don't know. I'm not sure. What do you think? These are good behaviours to manifest. Now, not every minute of every day, because that would I would have concerns that we're promoting the right people. But I use them. I speak to Craig, I speak to Martin, I speak to people in this room. And again, this is creating that right level of culture. I'll speak to David. I'll speak to people who have a view, have a perspective, to assist us getting it right. But creating that culture is really important. But I suppose my final point is I wouldn't always see command and control as being a negative. It's actually got real virtue, properly applied in the right circumstances.
Thanks. Did you want to come in, Martin?
Well, it's to say this about leadership.
Please.
Incredibly thoughtfully undertaken, quite a rigorous process of selection and approval for leadership. I've spoken at the Strategic Command course down in England about this, and appointed senior leaders on the basis of that. And that contrasts with a whole range of other professions, including many of the people in this room in academia. Again, when I was at the University of Strathclyde, the last thing you wanted to be was the head of department. In fact, you so didn't want to be it, you had it on rota. If you did it for a year, you didn't have to do it for another 10 years. So the leadership in academia, if that was happening in policing, God help you. It was just rotated. So we've all got to learn something about the rotation, about the deliberation and the training. The thing I would reinforce here is the critical importance of middle management in leadership. They hold the burden of the organisation in terms of culture. And that is often where they have the burden of service delivery as well. So they've got to be people-focused, delivery-focused. They've got to be looking upwards and looking downwards. And if there's one book anybody should read who's a manager, it should be Sir Michael Barber's book about delivery. Quite amusing, quite insightful, but it's also saying all the impediments to delivery. That was the first point I wanted to make. And the second one, if I could just make this very briefly. Again, I worked in America. If we were in America, Police Scotland would be the second largest police service in America. Only NYPD is bigger. So NYPD have this building the block process, which I love the term, but we do it better here. We have local police plans, we have community planning, but we don't have such a great term. So I think in leadership, hyperlocal is also important. Middle management, hyperlocal, and that's often more than we in this room can understand, because it's more complex, more varied. Let's look at the mental health report that Police Scotland gave to the Parliament this week. 30 pages packed with examples. So I say leadership is also about understanding that hyperlocal complexity, and if it's a failure, it's a failure of many surfaces to replicate good practice whilst retaining local flexibility, and that not just policing, it's a whole range of places.
Thanks so much, Martin. It's a really interesting point you made. Apart from anything else, I think the leadership workshop is going to be an absolute boon. So get your seats in early for that, because there's obviously plenty to talk about in the leadership angle. But just picking up on your notion of hyperlocal, and really we've got time for one final question. One of the things I've really noticed in the last couple of years is just the way Police Scotland is stepping into that global position, I suppose. It's increasingly, as far as I can see, interested in and engaged in things like the Global Police Innovation Exchange, which I mentioned earlier. Of course, we've got Nicola Russell, which we might not give back, as superintendent down at the AFP. And so secondments are a really important part of that. The International Academy, I guess, is being stood up. And also, I mean, just last week you were hosting the Global Leadership in Counter-Terrorism programme, which is a really important Five Eyes programme that Australia is involved in as well. So it strikes me that, you know, there's an increasing global view and perspective and action around Police Scotland. What do you think the one thing is that the rest of the world can learn from Police Scotland? Martin, maybe we'll start down at the end with you, picking up on your point, and then we'll work down the panel.
Well, I opened the International Police Academy with the First Minister, and I got no credit for it whatsoever for some reason. So I was absolutely delighted. I mean, I genuinely was delighted to do that, absolutely critical. So policing as a national asset, only possible because of a single police service, projecting the global citizen responsibilities of Scotland. Scotland wants to have just published a national strategy on this whole issue. Absolutely critical. What the other world can learn about this is human rights. It is extraordinary, and it wasn't my insight at all. At a seminar on the Police Foundation, I'm a huge admirer of this report, actually by the same Michael Barber. There's 2 mentions of human rights in the entire report, because you're not really able to talk about human rights in England and Wales. But it is central to the delivery of policing in Scotland. Iain can talk about his own role, but he's very passionate about talking about that. We regularly talk about human rights and the human rights approach to policing. So if there's one thing, it's to own the human rights, own the complexity of it, and the competing human rights. Because if it was simple, if it was a hierarchy, we could all do it. There's not. There are competing human rights. The classic example is the right to protest against the requirement to stay safe in public health, and how police policed that. We had independent assurance, and I also was engaged with that. So if there's one export, it shouldn't be the export, but I think it is. It's the confidence in discussing human rights within policing and the ownership of it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martin. Chief Constable.
I'll add to Martin's point briefly, if I may. I strongly agree with that. And again, colleagues in this room will have heard me say this often. And you know, Amar Anwar, or Lord Scott as he is now, John Scott as he was, are not in competition to be anointed as Scotland's leading human rights lawyer. I am, as the Chief Constable, because the organisation that I lead and what policing does day in, day out, does more to enable, facilitate, protect, ensure human rights than any other organisation. That's daily business. Martin talked about some of these challenges around about protests. We talked about the online space, where the challenge against privacy and protection, complex issues. But it's daily business. You close a road, people can't get to their work. The rights of the witness, the rights of the accused, the rights of the victim. Every day, police officers and police staff in control rooms and deployment to incidents are dealing with these things. They're not necessarily articulating them, although increasingly we are. But it goes to the heart of what the police service of Scotland is about, what policing in Scotland is about. And I do think that's something that we can take and we can share, and there's increasing interest in that. And again, it is back to the relationship and our purpose and why policing has its legitimacy. Because I do think that's something that there is interest in. I think, Vicky, you mentioned the debate about people retracting through, pressure of budget. The whole defund the police debate that erupted in North America and elsewhere, although I've noticed that there's been a real retraction from that. Actually, people are looking to policing to say, actually, Police Scotland, in that broader remit, that holistic model of safety and security that we're seeking to create, is actually in the right place. And it's not that it's not law enforcement, it's just that it's not only law enforcement. And as I said earlier, actually to carry out those critical tasks, They're a lot easier. They're still hard, but they're a lot easier if you're investing in confidence and legitimacy. You've got the consent, the knowing consent of your fellow citizens. So I think that is a major part of the DNA, if I can use that cliche, of policing in Scotland. I think this conference represents that level of openness, that challenge, the articulation around what policing should be about, and what policing should be doing to meet the needs of its fellow citizens. There is enormous amounts of academic and professional interest. I was at Harvard 8 weeks ago speaking at a public policy seminar specifically invited because of the level of change. Canadian chiefs, North American chiefs, chief of the LAPD, using the language of moving to guardian rather than warrior. I'm not fighting anything. I'm not at war with anybody. And neither should anybody in Police Scotland. We are public servants. We've got crucial tasks that we need to discharge. We need others to do more, but we will never ever walk away, because that's where we get our legitimacy from, is from our fellow citizens. So I think there is a lot of interest in that, as well as, bluntly, the lessons of change, good and bad, which again we can all speak very clearly on, and at times helps us all in our therapy sessions. So.
Thank you. Remind me never to sit after these two gentlemen. How did I come up with something else? You know, they've talked about human rights, they've talked about the ability to manage change, they've talked about delivering a service that is empowered and very customer, user-defined. What I don't see, and this is maybe just a wee counterpoint to this, so forgive me for going slightly off script, I don't see a celebration of success. I think some of the things that Police Scotland does are quite outstanding. And coming back from working down south for the last 5 or 6 years, looking at COP26, and I had a bit of a role with COP26 in my last job in the National Crime Agency, that was an outstanding delivery of peaceful protest, of a government event that the UK has not really seen the size or scale of, done in a way that facilitated the people of Glasgow and wider Scotland to go about their business in a safe and secure environment, and delivered, I think, on budget, Ian, but I think, you know, within the budget envelope.
It wasn't my budget, so I wasn't really it was. UK government were paying, we were sure of that.
But the bit for me is, and this is something Martin and I have talked about quite some length recently, we need to be cheering that from the rooftops. I've got a responsibility in that. Martin's got a responsibility in that, to say, when Police Scotland get it right, let's make a big note about it, because we've spent 10 years battling off the front pages of the Daily Record and the Sun and various others from everything Police Scotland did being a front page headline for the wrong reasons, often misdirected. So we need to be building that legitimacy, that understanding of the successes that Police Scotland achieve, and doing that far more vocally. And that's certainly something I'll be taking on. If there's evidence about good practice, we'll be shouting about it.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be very brief because I'm conscious that we're kind of running over and I might get into trouble. So I'm going to say, of course, probably the relationship that SIPC built up with Police Scotland for me is something that other people can learn. And I think indeed, as is evidence that, you know, police academic partnerships have actually modelled themselves on SIPC. So I think that's something we can all be proud of. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, you know, listen, maybe one of the things we've learned is don't trust Vicky to keep the time. So my apologies, I'm not sure you've got much of a tea break now, I'm afraid, but it's been really fascinating. Thank you all so much for you know, an hour of deep insights, reflections, challenges, perspectives, and all of this is content that we will take across over the next couple of days to digest in the margins, in the workshops, and, you know, challenge the ideas, challenge the thoughts, challenge yourself. I know I will take away a tremendous amount, some great new phrases as well, some great new turns of phrase. But mostly I just want to thank the panel for your time, busy diaries that you have, and I'm sure the audience will join me in saying thank you very much, and you've got us off to a great start.